I stood in front of the fogged-up mirror in the tiny bathroom of a motel on the outskirts of town, where rooms are rented by the hour and the walls seem to soak up other people's secrets. The light above the sink was too bright, and it made my reflection look sharp, almost merciless. Droplets of water on the glass distorted my face, as if I wasn't looking at myself, but at a woman I only knew from dreams. My wedding ring was turned inward toward my palm. I spun it absently, as I always did when I was nervous, and the metal pressed into my skin, a familiar, almost comforting pressure. Behind me stood a man. His hands rested on my hips, confidently, unhurriedly, as if he had every right to be there. My breath caught. My heart raced not from fear, but from a strange, forbidden relief. I felt seen. In the mirror, my lips looked swollen, as if I had just returned from someone else's life. My hair had escaped its style. My shoulders were tense, like someone who has just stepped into the void and hasn't yet fallen. I didn't recognize this face. There was none of my usual composure, none of that quiet, careful confidence with which I had left the house for years. There was something fragile and dangerous in it. The most terrifying thing at that moment wasn't the possibility of being caught. Not the risk, not the consequences, not the thin thread on which my life now hung. The most terrifying thing was something else. I didn't want it to end. My husband was certain I was late for a work call. He thought of me as a woman who always comes home on time, the one who folds the laundry on Sundays and kisses him in the hallway every morning without fail. He believed in my predictability as naturally as he believed in the sunrise. He didn't know where I really was, didn't know what air I was breathing, didn't know what I was doing behind his back. Conscience tried to scream. I could feel it somewhere deep inside, like a faint noise behind a thick door. But its voice drowned in another sensation, in how my body responded to another's presence, in how a wave rose inside me, unrelated to logic or duty. I caught myself thinking a thought that should have stopped me, but didn't. If this ends now, I won't regret the act. I'll regret the loss of this feeling. I looked in the mirror and saw two women. One, the one who knows how to be reliable, polite, convenient for the world. The one who keeps the house in order and never forgets dates. The other, the one who suddenly remembered what it's like to be desired not by role, not by habit, but by choice. And between them, there was no longer a clear boundary. I knew I had crossed a line, not just a physical one, the kind you can measure by the distance between bodies. I had crossed an inner boundary, where my certainty used to live. I'm not the kind of person who does this. I had always believed this about myself. In my stories, betrayal existed as an abstraction, a plot for other people's lives, not mine. And yet, here I was, in a room where my reflection shouldn't be, with a ring I hid from my own gaze. At that moment, time seemed to compress. My entire past life, neat mornings, shared dinners, conversations about the future, receded, becoming background, something distant and almost unreal. Only the present remained, sharp and demanding, as if someone had finally called me by a name I hadn't heard in a long time. I understood. After this door, there would be no going back to how things were. Even if I left now, even if I erased this episode from all calendars and messages, something inside me had already changed. But this realization, clear, cold, didn't stop me. It made my choice conscious. I took a step forward, allowing this moment to happen fully. And when conscience tried to raise its voice again, I didn't choose it. I chose desire. Not because I didn't know the price, but because at that second, I was ready to pay it. If someone had looked at my life from the outside, they wouldn't have seen cracks or voids. Everything looked neat, logical, almost exemplary. A house in a quiet neighborhood near the city center, a tidy lawn, neighbors who smile politely and don't ask unnecessary questions. Morning light in the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee, muted news on the radio. Repeating days, in which there was neither chaos nor pain. My husband, Nathan, was the kind of man people trust immediately. Not because he knew how to say the right words, but because there was no falseness in him. He woke up earlier than me to get to work, left a note on the table if he left too early, and always, without exception, texted if he was running late. He remembered dates, didn't forget the little things, kept his word even in what seemed insignificant. His presence was stable, like a rhythm you get so used to that you stop noticing it. We had been married for 11 years. long enough for our conversations to take the form of familiar routes. We discussed plans, purchases, bills, vacations that we kept putting off. We knew how to be a team, to decide, to agree, to divide responsibilities. Our marriage wasn't stormy. There were no dramas, loud fights, slamming doors. There was none of what is usually called problems. And that was exactly why it was so hard for me to admit that something inside me was dying. I couldn't point to a specific moment when it started. There was no betrayal on his part, no indifference, no sudden cooling. Everything happened slowly, almost imperceptibly. Conversations became shorter and more practical. We discussed what to buy, where to go on the weekend, when to pay the bills. Words no longer sought each other. They performed a function. Touch changed too. His hand on my back as he passed me in the kitchen, his kiss before leaving, habitual, precise, without hesitation. It was all correct. But in this correctness, there was no room for surprise, for excitement, for that feeling that makes your heart suddenly beat differently. I told myself that this was how it should be. That this is what mature love looks like. Calm, steady, without storms. I repeated this like a mantra. We lived without conflict, and this seemed like a sign of success. But the silence between us wasn't empty. It was filled with what we no longer asked about. He rarely asked how I felt because he saw no reason to doubt. And I spoke less and less about myself because I didn't know how to explain the vague sense of absence. Sometimes in the evenings, when we sat on the couch watching the same show, I caught myself thinking a strange thought. If I disappeared now, if I just got up and walked out the door, what would be left of me? Who would I be outside this role? Wife, partner, reliable person? I never said this out loud. These thoughts seemed ungrateful, almost cruel to a person who had never done me wrong. Nathan loved me in the way people love when they are certain of tomorrow. His love was steady, caring, free of doubt. He didn't doubt me, didn't get jealous, didn't check up on me. He believed in me as naturally as he believed in his own reflection in the mirror in the mornings. Sometimes, looking at him, I felt not gratitude, but a strange heaviness, as if I were being entrusted with the responsibility of living up to an image I was no longer sure I could carry. I continued to do everything right. Came home on time, made dinner, asked how his day was, listened, nodded, asked follow-up questions. I was the woman people were used to seeing. And in this outward correctness, there wasn't a single visible crack. But inside, a feeling was building that I couldn't name. It wasn't unhappiness. It wasn't longing in the usual sense. Rather, it was a lack of response. As if part of me existed in a room no one had entered for a long time. I tried to convince myself that it was just fatigue. That all long-term relationships go through a phase of routine. That desire can't stay sharp forever. And that the real value is in stability, in reliability, in being able to make plans and be sure there is a person next to you who won't disappear. I repeated this again and again, as if the number of repetitions would make the thought true. But sometimes, when Nathan slept beside me, calm and confident, I would look at the ceiling and feel a strange emptiness, not directly related to him. It was a feeling of my own invisibility, as if I had dissolved into a well-built system where everything functions, but where I, as an individual, was no longer distinguished. I wasn't looking for another man. I wasn't planning to cheat. I wasn't imagining a double life. At that time, I sincerely considered myself a woman who would never cross that line. I just kept catching myself thinking that I wanted to feel something different, not necessarily forbidden, not necessarily destructive, just alive. It seemed I could live like this my whole life. Correctly, quietly, without scandals, without pain. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a dangerous thought was ripening. If one day I had the chance to feel like myself, not a role, would I be able to refuse it? Then I didn't yet know that this question had already begun to seek an answer. I wasn't looking for change. Not in the sense that people look for a way out of a marriage or salvation from loneliness. I just wanted to regain the feeling of being present in my own body. That strange, almost forgotten feeling when you're not just performing functions, but existing. So the decision to sign up for a gym near work seemed harmless to me. I told Nathan I wanted to move more, that it was good for my health, that I needed to shake things up. He smiled and supported me without questions. I started going there on weekdays in the late afternoon, when work hours weren't over yet, and the gym was less crowded. I put on headphones, focused on the exercises, avoided eye contact. This was my time, my small territory, where no one expected me to talk about bills or weekend plans. There, for the first time in a long time, I felt my body not as a tool for daily life, but as something alive. That was where I noticed him. His name was Marcus. He wasn't the type to deliberately attract attention. Not loud, not demonstrative, not the kind around whom glances gather. There was something collected and calm about him, a confidence without showy strength. He moved as if he knew exactly why he was in that space, and didn't need anyone to confirm it. Sometimes our eyes met, and he lingered a fraction of a second longer than usual, but in a way that couldn't be called flirting. At first, it was small things. A nod instead of a greeting. A door held open for me. His gesture when he gave me a free machine during a busy hour. Nothing that could be brought to the surface and called significant. I didn't go home thinking about him. Didn't replay his face in my mind. I wouldn't even have said then that I liked him. But tension doesn't need words. It arises in pauses, in brief intersections of glances, in the feeling of being noticed. I began to catch myself dressing for the gym a little more carefully, lingering in the locker room, checking my phone, though no one had written. Something inside me seemed to be tuning in to the presence of another person, not yet realizing what was happening. We didn't cross any boundaries. No conversations that could be called personal, no touches. And yet, between us, a space emerged that was too meaningful for simple politeness. Sometimes we exchanged a few words about workouts, about time, about the weather. The conversations were fragmentary, devoid of context. But there was a tension in them. Not domestic, not formal, but directed precisely at me. I told myself it meant nothing. That people are prone to notice each other. That it was just human interaction. And perhaps that would have been the end of it, if not for one detail. Next to Marcus, I didn't feel like a wife, not part of a couple, not someone's other half. I felt like a separate being. For the first time in a long time, my heart began to beat a little faster, not from fatigue, but from anticipation. Not because he did anything special, but because I knew. He was looking, seeing, noting. I didn't tell Nathan about Marcus. Not because there was anything to hide, but because he wasn't part of my correct life. He existed in another dimension, where I allowed myself not to be explainable. The first changes were almost imperceptible. I started checking the time more often during workouts. Sometimes I stayed longer than usual, pretending I hadn't finished my set. I began to choose times when the chance of running into him was higher. It seemed funny and harmless to me, a small weakness with no consequences. The first real lie appeared quietly, without drama. One evening, I told Nathan that the gym had started a new evening program, that it was good for flexibility, and that I might come home later. He wasn't surprised. Didn't ask a single question. Just said to be careful and not to overdo it. His trust should have stopped me. I understood this intellectually. But inside, the opposite happened. The absence of suspicion didn't restrain me, but seemed to give permission. If he believed me unconditionally, then everything was under control. Then I wasn't destroying anything. That evening, Marcus and I were alone together for the first time. Not in a romantic place. In the parking lot behind the building, where a few cars stood and the lamplight made the space almost unreal. We sat in his car, not touching, as if both of us understood that it was precisely in this inaction that the boundary we could still choose not to cross was hidden. We spoke in fragments. About work. About how tiring it is to be part of a system where everything has long been defined. About the strange feeling of loneliness that arises even when there is someone next to you, sharing your bed and your daily life. These weren't confessions. Rather, careful touches to those places inside that are rarely spoken aloud. The air between us was thick, tense, almost tangible. When he looked at me longer than usual, I understood. The question had already been asked. Not in words. In everything that was happening between us and the silence. When he leaned in, I could have pulled away. There was no pressure, no insistence. Everything depended on my movement. The kiss was slow, exploratory, not demanding immediate continuation. It was less an action than a question. Are you here because that's how it turned out? Or because you want to be here? I answered, not with words. I leaned toward him. At that moment, I didn't yet feel like the destroyer of my own life. It seemed to me that I had simply allowed myself one step off the usual path. Nothing had yet been lost. Nothing had yet been broken. But something inside me had already shifted. Not toward him, toward myself. For the first time, I understood that I could look a person in the eyes, talk about tomorrow, about dinner plans, about the weekend, and at the same time keep a secret inside that didn't make my hands shake. I didn't become a different person in one night. I simply learned to be someone who knows how to hide. After that night, a second dimension appeared in my reality. It didn't displace the first, it lay over it, like a thin, almost transparent layer that could go unnoticed if you didn't look too closely. On the outside, nothing changed. I still woke up next to Nathan, made coffee, listened to his stories about work, discussed purchases and plans. We lived in our usual rhythm, where everyone knew their place, where the future didn't require clarification. I smiled at him as before. I touched his hand in the car. I asked how his day was and really listened to the answer. My correct, life continued to exist. Whole, logical, not arousing suspicion. But inside me, another life was already underway. I learned to distribute myself. Not by time, by states. With Nathan, I was calm, composed, reliable. With Marcus, I was tense, attentive, alive. These weren't roles I put on and took off consciously. Rather, two different ways of breathing. We began to meet regularly. Without grand words, without promises, without the need to name anything. We had days, hours, unspoken signals. I knew which afternoons Nathan stayed late at work. Knew which evenings he went to help his father. These time windows took on another meaning. I no longer looked for excuses, they were already ready. Workouts, meetings, errands. I became precise with schedules, attentive to details, careful with traces. I learned to delete messages. Erase calls. Not leave receipts. Not forget to clear location history. It wasn't like panic. Rather, the cold composure of someone who is aware of the risk and considers it acceptable. With Marcus, everything felt different. He looked at me as if he saw not the woman I was at home, but the one I myself hadn't seen in a long time. Not wife, not reliable partner, not part of an established structure. He saw me as a separate being, with desires, doubts, tension that couldn't be shelved. The affair didn't feel like destruction. It felt like oxygen. I didn't tell myself, I am betraying. I told myself, I am returning to myself. I told myself, I've been correct for so many years, I deserve something of my own. These thoughts didn't come as justifications, they arose as obvious truths. As if someone inside me had finally spoken what I was afraid to admit. My life was safe, but not entirely mine. Physical intimacy arose quickly, but it wasn't the center. What mattered was something else, the tense silence between us, in which every movement seemed meaningful. How he listened to me without interrupting. How he noticed the little things. How I held my breath when I was nervous. How I avoided his gaze when I spoke honestly about myself. With him, I didn't need to be understood. I needed to be real. I began to think about him more often than I allowed myself to admit. But this wasn't romantic daydreaming. It was a feeling of dependence on a state that arose next to him. When I was with Marcus, the outside world lost its density. I forgot to check my phone. Forgot to watch the time. These hours existed outside of consequences, as if we were in a space where the rules didn't apply. At home, everything changed imperceptibly. I stopped wearing my wedding ring to the gym. At first, because it was more convenient, I told myself. Then, because it reminded me of the life I was temporarily setting aside. I began to get irritated by little things. Could snap at Nathan if he asked too many questions or tried to involve me in conversation when I was mentally elsewhere. I needed him to be imperfect. I needed to have reasons. I caught myself rewriting our history in my own mind. Remembering moments when I felt undervalued, misunderstood, left without response. Blowing small grievances up to the size of arguments. Telling myself that I had been lonely long before Marcus. That all this wasn't a sudden choice, but the result of a long inner absence. There were moments when guilt rose almost physically. When I saw Nathan sleeping next to me, calm and trusting. When he took my hand in the store, as if nothing had changed between us. When he talked about our future, about trips, about plans, about a life he was certain of. At such moments, it became hard to breathe. But I learned to handle this guilt. I called it background noise. Told myself that he didn't know, so he wasn't in pain. That ignorance protected him. That the truth would only destroy what was still whole. I believed I could keep these two worlds separate, not allowing them to touch. I lived on the edge. The longer it went on, the more clearly I felt that the affair was no longer an escape. It had become a second home, not a place to go to wait things out, but a space where I finally didn't have to explain who I was. And it was then that a thought arose in me that should have frightened me. I no longer asked myself if I would be caught. I asked myself what exactly I was willing to lose if it happened. The most alarming thing wasn't that I was risking my marriage. The most alarming thing was that I was no longer sure I would stop, even if I knew that the end would destroy everything. I continued to live as before, but I was no longer the same. Autumn arrived unnoticed. The trees along the streets began to lose their leaves. The air became sharper, and the days shorter, as if reality itself was hinting something was coming to an end. My life, meanwhile, had acquired a frighteningly well-tuned rhythm. I moved between two versions of myself with a precision that would once have seemed impossible to me. In the morning, I was a wife, made coffee, discussed the day's plans with Nathan, listened to his stories about work. I smiled, joked, pretended everything was in its place. In the afternoons and stolen hours, I became someone else, the one who lived in the tense present next to Marcus, in a space where desires drowned out consequences. It seemed to me that I was in control, that I had everything under control, that I had learned to separate realities so that neither destroyed the other. I was wrong. Nathan began to sense the distance before he realized it. He didn't make scenes, didn't ask direct questions. His changes were almost imperceptible, longer glances, pauses before answers, attention to details he hadn't paid attention to before. He began to ask about my day more often, not formally, but with that calm, focused interest that couldn't be brushed off as habit. "You were at the gym for a long time today," he said one evening. His tone was soft, almost neutral. I nodded and added a few words about the new program, about stretching, about how it was good for me. He accepted the explanation, but his gaze lingered on me a little longer than usual. There was no suspicion in it. There was something else, the wariness of a person who begins to notice shifts in a familiar landscape. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. I listened to his breathing, steady and confident, and thought about how intuition rarely needs proof. Sometimes it just finds its way. At the same time, Marcus began to change. The more time we spent together, the more clearly the boundaries of his world emerged, ones that hadn't existed in my imagination. He avoided conversations about the future, gently steered away from topics where the word later sounded. When I said that this couldn't go on forever, he responded with a half-smile, changed the subject, suggested focusing on the present. He liked the secrecy too much. It made everything easier, simpler, didn't require decisions. I began to understand. For him, I was an escape. For me, a choice that had already cost too much to consider it temporary. This realization didn't sober me up. It made me stubborn. I had already crossed too many inner boundaries to stop. I clung to the illusion that the risk itself confirmed the significance of what was happening between us. If I was willing to put everything on the line, then it had to mean something. The first real fear came unexpectedly. One day, stuck in traffic, I saw a familiar car in the parking lot of the gym, Nathan's car. At a time when he was never supposed to be there, my heart seemed to drop inside me. I drove past without stopping, my hands shaking on the wheel, as if this movement could change what had already happened. Later, he said that a meeting at work had been canceled, and he had left early. Mentioned the gym in passing, as if it were nothing. Said he was thinking of going there with me sometime. I laughed too loudly, changed the subject too quickly. He noticed. I saw it in the way his expression changed for a fraction of a second. Not anger, not suspicion, but a quiet realization. From that evening, the house became different. Quieter, more tense, as if the air was filled with questions that hadn't yet been asked, but already existed. Nathan began to ask carefully, almost imperceptibly, about details, about time, about people I mentioned in passing. I answered confidently, too confidently. Lying no longer came as easily as before. It required effort, attention, constant readiness not to make a mistake. Every conversation became a test, every evening a rehearsal. The affair stopped feeling like oxygen. It became pressure. Marcus began to cancel meetings at the last minute. Sometimes he disappeared for hours, then returned with explanations that were more charming than clear. When I looked for confirmation in his words that this was as serious for him as it was for me, he responded with softness, evasion, That same space of uncertainty in which it's easy to live if you're not bearing the main risk. I realized that the balance had been broken from the start. I was risking my home, my marriage, my identity. Only his convenience. This hurt more than I expected. One day, Nathan found a receipt from a small hotel on the other side of town in my car. I said I had given a colleague a ride and she had paid in cash, and the receipt had been left with me by mistake. The words sounded smooth, almost convincing, but something fragile hung between us. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, just nodded and went into another room. The silence after that conversation was worse than any scandal. I stopped sleeping, began to startle at sounds. Checked my phone so often it became an obsession. The double life no longer seemed bold and alive. It was heavy, tense, demanding constant concentration. One evening, Nathan looked at me as if searching not for an answer, but for confirmation of his own feelings, and quietly asked, "Are you happy?" The question didn't sound like an accusation, not like an attempt to expose me. It sounded like a request for truth. I said yes. The word turned out empty. I felt it even before he looked away. He looked at me for a long time, as if trying to memorize what he saw, then said he loved me and went upstairs alone. That night, I cried in the bathroom, the door closed so it wouldn't be heard. Not because of Marcus, and not only because of Nathan. I cried for myself, for what I had become, for the exhaustion from lying, for the fear of the moment that could no longer be postponed. I understood then. The truth was no longer hiding. It was moving around me, slowly, patiently, like something that knows it doesn't need to hurry. When it entered my life, it wouldn't be loud. It would be final. By the end of the week, Nathan began to look more closely at timelines, ask mutual acquaintances innocent questions, notice inconsistencies that hadn't mattered before. I felt it in the air, the silence before exposure. The places where I could hide were running out. And for the first time since it all began, fear was stronger than desire. Not the fear of losing Marcus. The fear of being left face to face with myself, when everything I had built on secrecy finally collapsed. The truth didn't burst into my life with a scream. It didn't come in the form of broken dishes, slamming doors, or shouted accusations. It entered as all final things do, quietly, without drama, leaving behind a void that couldn't be filled. That evening, I came home later than usual. The house was immersed in soft semi-darkness, in which Nathan's presence was always felt, even when he was silent. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't cozy. It was concentrated. He was sitting at the kitchen table. In front of him lay my phone, turned screen down, as if he no longer wanted to see what he had already seen. His posture was straight, his movements restrained. There was no fuss, no trembling, only fatigue, too deep to be mistaken for anger. "Sit down," he said calmly. I didn't need to ask what had happened. I knew. The calendar, location history, messages I thought I had deleted. I had underestimated the traces left even by the most careful lie. He didn't ask who it was. He asked, "How long?" When I answered, his face didn't change abruptly, but as the light in a room changes when someone closes the curtains. There was no shouting. There was realization. Grief without outward signs, but with a destructive depth. He asked if I loved the other man. I said, "I don't know." These words hurt him more than any directness. I saw it in the way his gaze lost focus for a second, as if he were trying to hold inside something that had already begun to crumble. He didn't ask questions out of a desire to punish. He wanted to understand where exactly what he considered our life had disappeared. He asked if I had been careful, if I had let another person into our home, our bed, into the space he had always considered protected. I answered honestly, because at that moment, there was no point in saving myself. Each confession sounded like a closing door. Nathan stood up slowly. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse, didn't call me names I deserved more than silence. He said only one thing. "Our marriage ended the moment you decided to live a second life." His words weren't a threat. They were a fact. He said that trust, destroyed in this way, isn't healed by time. It isn't restored by effort. It dies. He asked me to leave. Not to take a break. Not to think. Forever. He gave me an hour to pack the essentials. Said he would file for divorce in the morning. I went upstairs as if through water. Each room seemed filled with the past. Photographs, habits, traces of our shared life. I opened drawers, and each item felt heavy, like a reminder of what I no longer had the right to. In the bedroom, I stopped in front of the mirror. The woman looking back at me was unfamiliar. There was something broken and exposed in her face. Not a romantic tragedy, not a dramatic heroine. Just a person who had made a choice and now stood among its consequences. I wrote to Marcus. Briefly, said everything had come out. That I had nowhere to go. That I was scared. I wasn't waiting for excuses. I was waiting for confirmation that what I had destroyed my own life for was real. The reply came 20 minutes later. He wrote that he was sorry, that he didn't want scandals, that it was never supposed to get complicated. At that moment, the illusion died completely. I understood. What I had called a connection was convenience for him. I had put everything on the line. Only his comfort. I left the house almost at midnight. The car was packed with bags, but inside was empty. Nathan didn't come out. The porch light didn't come on. There was no last look, no last word, not even a formal goodbye. Sometimes the end looks just like that, not like a scene, but like an absence. That night, I spent in the car. Then everything started happening quickly. Divorce. The silence of friends. Changed intonations in the voices of acquaintances. I became a story told in whispers. An example. A warning. Marcus disappeared. Blocked my number. Stopped existing in my reality as suddenly as he had entered it. I rented a small apartment on the outskirts of town. It smelled of fresh paint and loneliness. On the first night, I sat on the floor among boxes and for the first time allowed myself to feel everything fully. Not just the loss of my marriage, but the loss of my former self. The woman who was trusted. The one who had a place in someone's life. Nathan never wrote again. Never sought explanations. Never demanded closure. He left with that calm resolve that hurts more than hatred. He simply chose a life without me. I often replay the past in my mind. Moments where I could have stopped. Words I could have left unsaid. Steps that could have changed everything. But the past doesn't answer questions. It only reminds. Consequences last longer than any flashes of desire. I lost a good person. Lost a safe life. And what I did it for didn't even stay to watch the destruction. This isn't a story of redemption. It's a story of clarity. About how betrayal seems thrilling until it takes everything from you. About how a secret corrodes the soul long before it destroys a relationship. About how some doors close not because of fate, but because of choice. Now I live with this knowledge. Alone, conscious, and fully understanding. There are mistakes you don't pay for with a moment of pain, but with all the remaining silence of your life.